Hi guys, here's your copper and sulfur rubric, which you should have looked at before you submitted your copper and sulfur lab. Let me just take you through how I graded them. If you've already submitted it, this will help you make corrections, and if you haven't submitted it yet, this will help you plan ahead. Let's start with the first row for the histogram. Your histogram, there's a lot of points to get here, and they're easy to get because I gave you a tutorial that shows you exactly how to make that histogram. So basically, as long as you followed the directions on that tutorial and you put all of the data from all of the classes there, you should get most of the points. So the first 15 points for presentation, following directions, and supporting details come from just doing what you were told to do, right? Putting all of the data on the histogram and putting that arrow that goes to the right and putting a box for an outlier, for outliers. Also, another thing you had to do in order to get the 10 points for higher level thinking and full credit for your following directions, you had to bring the histogram up in your validity paragraph. Many of you did not do this. Validity, the whether or not an experiment is valid, has to do with several things. One is, did we run enough trials? I have to tell you, we sure did. That's because you're not the only person who ran this experiment. All of my students in all of my classes ran it. That's why I gave you all of the data from all of my classes, so that you would have enough data to evaluate the validity in the first place. So your validity paragraph has to talk about the data that you got from all the classes and what the histogram shows about that data. Now, that's a matter of opinion. Some people felt that the data had too many outliers, it was scattered all over the place, and therefore it wasn't precise enough for them to draw a conclusion. Some people felt that despite all those outliers and despite the fact that, there was stuff to either side of the main peak, there was enough data in that main peak to show a trend, and they said that it was precise enough to draw a conclusion. It really doesn't matter which position you take, but you have to take a position if you want all of the higher level thinking points for the histogram, because there's just no higher level thinking whatsoever until you get to that part of it, right? So you have to talk about your histogram in your validity paragraph. That takes me to the validity paragraph. You would lose a point in your validity paragraph if you did not double space it. That was true for all the paragraphs. So that was the only direction I gave you that you had to follow, and that was also a matter of presentation. It should, look nicer if it is double spaced. It's easier for me to grade. Supporting detail-wise, you had to bring up several things. You had to bring up the histogram and whether or not the data was precise. You had to talk in your validity paragraph about whether or not the procedures for the experiment did things that make a procedure valid. For example, did the procedures attempt to keep all the variables constant? Now, it may be true that individual groups didn't keep their variables constant, but were the procedures that I gave you, if everybody had followed those procedures, would those have been valid procedures? Were there sources of error that you can point to? And as I said before, were there enough trials for you to determine whether or not there's a trend? So you have to talk about whether or not variables are kept constant, whether or not there are sources of error, whether or not the data is precise, and whether or not there's enough data. You have to talk about all those things in order to get the supporting details points. How you talk about them gives you your higher level thinking points. So again, it's a matter of opinion whether or not this was a valid experiment. But how you defend your answer matters. You have to have not just supporting details, but details that make sense. For the identity of your slug, many of you were unable to decide what your slug was, and that's fine, but you should still have enough supporting detail to make me think that you tried to figure out what your slug was. You should tell me what characteristic properties you tested, what data you got, and how that compares to the data that you had for the 3 substances it could have been. Many of you told me that you found the density, you looked at the spectra, you tried to see if it was soluble, but you didn't tell me what the results of those experiments were. You didn't tell me what your density was, or you didn't tell me, what color your spectra test was. You didn't tell me whether or not it dissolved. You just said that you tested those things and this is what you concluded. You have to tell me not only what you tested and what the results were, but how those compare to the real characteristic properties of the substances that you're comparing them to. And then for the change, for telling me whether this is chemical or physical, there are 3 things that I'm looking for that you can point to tell you whether or not the change was chemical or physical. Changes that are chemical result in new substances forming. If you think you have evidence that a new substance or substances formed, you should tell me what that evidence is if you want to get credit for the supporting details. Just the fact that you think a new substance was formed is not enough. You have to say, what did it look like? How is it different from the original substance? Another thing that shows that a chemical change has happened is if energy is produced beyond what you put into the system. So if you saw some evidence of that, you should bring that up. Another piece of evidence that indicates a chemical change would be that the reaction that happened doesn't seem to be easily reversible. All chemical reactions are reversible, they're just not necessarily easily reversible. If you got a result that you say, well, I don't even know how to begin to get back to what I had originally, that's an indication that you have a chemical change. By contrast, physical changes are easily reversible. You melt it and then it refreezes. You cut it in half and then you can line it back up again and have it, have the same shape and so on. Physical changes, rather, do not result in new substances. Even if new properties form, they're temporary new properties. Like when you boil something, it turns to a gas, so it has a new property. It's a new state of matter, but that gas will return to the liquid state if cooled. The fact that a gas is produced is not necessarily evidence of a chemical change. You could just be going through a state change, right? So keep all of that in mind as you write that paragraph. So you have to have not only do you have to bring up the general things that make a chemical or a physical change happen, but the evidence you have that those things occurred. So if you're going to say, for example, that you have evidence of a chemical change because there was more energy released than was put in, you better mention how you know that. What did you see that indicated that? Okay, so you can go back and fix anything that you need to fix and resubmit. It would be very helpful if you would print this out for me and give it to me if you're resubmitting, just because it gets very confusing when I have multiple electronic submissions. It gets really hard to keep track of stuff. So if you've already submitted, it would help me a lot if you would just print out your histogram and your essays, and don't forget to double space because that does cost you points if you don't do that. Okay guys, see you in class.